Okay, in this lesson we're going to talk about the inverse variation. There is direct variation and there is inverse variation. Direct variation is in the form of y equals to k times x, where k is just a number or constant. And inverse variation is in the form of y is equal to k over x. K is just another number, or we call it constant. So the difference between direct variation and inverse variation is that in the direct variation, as x increases, y increases. For the inverse variation, if x increases, y decreases. Also, if you look at the original that equation, if you divide both sides by x, you will get k is equal to y over x. You divide both sides by x. That means the ratio of y to x is constant. If you divide y value by x value, you should have the same number. In the inverse variation, if you kind of manipulate that equation, if you multiply both sides by x, x times y is equal to k, because x will cancel out. This is kind of important because it tells us that the product of x and y, if you multiply x and y, you will get the same number k. So product of x and y is always constant in the inverse variation. K, as I mentioned, is just a number. We call the k the constant of variation. Because it's the number, we call it constant, because it kind of decides like how direct and how inverse the two variables vary each other. So it's constant of variation. And k cannot be 0, because if k was 0, this equation will just turn out to be y is equal to 0. And that will just be y equals to 0 again. So let's go through this example problem. So they give you two tables, A and B. And the direction is the relationship between the variables a direct variation or an inverse variation or neither. So it can be one of any three situations. So if it is a direct variation, we'll have y equals to k times x. If it is an inverse variation, we'll have y equals to k over x. If it's neither, then we're not going to have either this or that. It will be something else. Write the function models for the direct and inverse variation. So let's look at the A table first. So when you deal with this kind of problem, you want to ask yourself if it's direct or inverse. So the way you can tell is if x increases, does the y increase or decrease? Well, you can kind of see that from here to here, x increases. X values go up all the time. So as x increases, does y increase or decrease? Well, y decreases. So maybe this is possibly the inverse variation. So possibly inverse, but we are not perfectly sure yet, because it can be just neither of them. So because we are kind of assuming, well, we are kind of like predicting that it might be inverse variation, we have to look at the condition for the inverse variation. If it is an inverse variation, the product of x and y must be constant. That means if I multiply x values and y values, I should get the same number. So let's multiply x and y. 2 times 15 is 30. 4 times 7.5 is again 30. 10 times 3 is 30. 15 times 2 is again 30. So the product of x and y is constant. That means it is for sure inverse variation. So we can be confident about that. If our prediction was that this possibly be the direct variation, then we would have looked at the ratio of y over x. That means we're going to divide y value by x value and see if we have the same number. But because as x increases, y decreases, we just check their product. We just multiply and then see if we get the same number. So we know because the product is 30, we know k is 30. So the equation for inverse variation is y is equal to k over x. Now we know that k is 30. The equation for this specific function would be y is equal to 30 over x. So these are the answer for A problem. Now let's look at the B. Okay, first you want to figure out if x increases, whether or not y increase. So from here to here, x always increases. Well, you can kind of see that as x does that, y decreases. So that means it's possibly inverse. We are not sure yet. To check that, the condition of the inverse variation is that their product must be same. So again, we check their product. 2 times 10 is 20. 4 times 8 is 32. We already know that these numbers are not same. So that means this is not inverse. It cannot be the direct variation either, because if this was a direct variation, as x increases, y must increase as well. But this is not the case, so it cannot be direct, so the answer will be neither. Because it's neither, we do not have to write the function, because that's not direct or inverse. Okay, let's move on to the second example. Suppose that x and y varies inversely. So, and x is 4 when y is 12. What function models the inverse variation? So to begin with, we know that x and y varies inversely. We don't know how much inversely or anything, but we know they vary inversely. So write the general form of the inverse variation. So general form of the inverse variation is y is equal to k over x. We don't know what k is yet. To figure out k, we substitute for x and y because they gave you a piece of information. If x is 4, y is 12. That means if I plug in 12 to y and 4 to x, I should get k by itself. Now I multiply both sides by k. K is 4 times 12, which is 48. Now we know the k is 48. Using our general form, we can just write the full equation, which is y is equal to 48 over x. Okay, the second problem is, what does a graph of this function look like? Make a table and sketch the graph. Okay, so we can make a table. If x is 1, then y would be 48. If x is 2, y would be 48 over 2 will be 24. If x is 3, 48 divided by 3 is 16. If x was 4, 48 divided by 4 is 12. And let me just continue in that table. If x was, let's say, 6, then 48 divided by 6 is 8. If x was like 8, that would be 6. If x was 12, I will get 4. If x was 24, I will get 2, and so on. So let's plot a few points. 1, 48. 48 is off the chart, so you can skip that. 2, 24. 24 is again off chart. It's maybe around here. 3, 16. That one we can plot. And 4, 12 is around here. And 6, 8, 8, 6, 12, 4. So the graph kind of looks like that. So you can see that as x increases, y decreases. Okay, so now we know the graph. The third problem is, what is y when x is 10? So now we have this equation. I can just plug in 10 into x and figure out the y. Y is equal to 48 over 10, which is 4.8.